Well, the house was built by my parents in 1931, but my dad was the sort of the chief contractor, and he was very good at design and construction, and he was not only superintendent of schools, but he was an excellent cabinet maker. So everything that he could make for himself, he would. He was a self-styled, self-made Yorkshireman who found his way to Victoria in 1911 with his grandparents and family, of course. And so I'm a fourth generation Victorian, but the first to be born here. But my dad was very good at practical things as well as being a very good administrator of schools, which is a highly charged and political job, as you know. But it was his leadership in education that got me going into it, and his love for history, which became for me in due time my own passion. So it's a legacy. Yes, I'm pleased about that. Thank you. Yes, he did this design, and I helped with the carving, and it's made of oak, but the oak, the method of doing that carving and finishing things up was, a bit of a trick. So I'm very glad that we've got that as the living remembrance of those times together. Yes. Yes, I was one of her students in the early 60s at UBC, and Canadian history was in those days a 400 level uh, introductory project, but she had all the people who were going on into the Department of External Affairs or Public Service or into education as her students. And, it was a passionate instruction in the intricacies of Canadian politics, because Margaret Ormsby was from the interior, from the Vernon area, and came from a family of fruit producers, and they were always engaged in federal-provincial relations about trade and access, and so she was very conscious about that. But she was also very conscious about Sir Richard McBride, who has become a subject of great interest for me. He's like the James Douglas of the early 20th century and the late 19th century as well. But Margaret Ormsby, her mission, and this is expressed, I think, in her Centennial History of British Columbia, which is, still a vitally important book. If you look at the notes and the references and the documentation that she used from the BC archives, it's just encyclopedic and very valuable. She encouraged us as working historians to be not only true to our craft and the best we could as working historians and scholars, but also to be great practitioners of history in being able to tell the story to a wider audience. And I took this seriously, and as I grew in my knowledge of history, increasing the depth of my knowledge of history and broadening my interest in it, I always kept in mind what she said about the necessity of being able to articulate for the general public and the readership. I regard being a historian as an interlocutor, that is to say, somebody who's telling the story between what I know myself and have learned myself and have puzzled through on my own score, but to be able to communicate it to my reader. And it was because of this that I went back really to the Greek and Roman models of telling of history as historia, the story, and to feature the characters who, Donald Grant Creighton, who was a contemporary of Margaret Ormsby's, was keen about character and circumstance. And it was his interest in this sort of thing about being able to tell the story that led me eventually not only to become a historian, but a biographer. A biographer who uses history as the vehicle in which to talk about the times and the circumstances and the engagements of that past, the difficulties, the successes, the complications. History tends to be a story of struggles and conflicts, and out of conflicts, you get these stories, and so it was with Alexander Mackenzie and Peter Pond and Richard Blanchard and others that I've written about as subjects of biography. Also Winston Churchill and Jackie Fisher at the Admiralty. So the lives of these people is very important. And Margaret Ormsby was keen on Sir Richard McBride, and also keen on W.A.C. Bennett as an example of a subject to write about in a way of telling a story through a person's life or a person's management. It's a fascinating thing to go behind the scenes and to study the life and times of these people, but also what drove them to do the things that they did and the problems that they faced, and the successes or the failures that they had. And the world is full of historical failures who are nonetheless fascinating people in terms of biography. And Richard Blanchard is one of those people who mounts the stage of history, and we see him departing from Victoria in the summer of 1851, and sayonara. People know nothing about him, but to chase back and recover the whole history of his past, his great work as a justice of the peace and as a yachtsman, a distinguished yachtsman, and a very wealthy man in insurance and shipping and coal management, and the running of big estates was for me a fascinating thing. I actually found the place where he died, which is in Marylebone in West London. Nobody had bothered to do that before, but I find these individual interests of people very interesting to talk about. Reference Blanchard, I went to the BC archives to see if I could find his commission, and I did find it. It had to be specially brought forward out of the archives, and it was all damaged because it had fallen into the Chagres River in Panama on the way home. But anyway, the archivist said, well, why don't you just use the one of James Douglas? We've got it here, it's much better condition. And I thought to myself, this is kind of emblematic of the whole story. Blanchard is the forgotten person. There's a street named after him in a building, but what's the backstory on a person like this? So, my mission in the Blanchard story, as with others, is to try to put flesh on the bones and see where they went after they were here. And just to conclude this part of the story, his story comes absolutely full circle when he testifies in Parliament in 1857 at the Parliamentary Inquiry, the House of Commons, and he tells all. And his extensive testimony is a damning indictment of James Douglas and the land-holding operations that were out here. And he's not opposed to the Indigenous policies of the Hudson Bay Company, but in fact, that's the only kind thing he has to say about the HBC here. But the point is, Trevor, is that get in the backstories, bring new material. And one of the problems of BC history is it gets recycled so often without new material coming forward. And I'm a firm believer that you have to have new material if you possibly can bring new vitality to the general story. The history of Canada runs deep in regard to American attempts to take control. There was the Phipps expedition in the late 1600s. There was Benedict Arnold going to Quebec in 1775. I've written about that in the Dorchester Review recently. And there was the War of 1812. There was the Manifest Destiny that emerged in the Minnesota area and Red River in the 1860s. And for 1840s, we've got the Oregon Crisis, which is the backstory for the Hudson Bay Company's Charter of Rights and the grant to establish the colony here. So we have been having a centuries-old tussle with the American frontier, but we haven't had such an not articulate, but so in-your-face statement by a fellow who hasn't even been sworn into office, and all of a sudden we're shaking in our boots because of it. But I think our foreign policy has been a little somnolent. I don't think it has been aggressive enough about proclaiming who we are and what we stand for. We've taken a lot of this for granted. to some degree, as Trump says, we're to some degree a client state because our defense is looked after. And, you know, we need to beef things up in NORAD and in NATO and show our presence. But we've also got to, I think, carve ourselves out as a separate North American destiny, which history has proven that we are a separate destiny. But we need to be more vociferous and more argumentative, and we need you know, articulate statesmen and persons who can vouchsafe that Canada is one of the great projects of the world, and it is, and it's one of the most successful federations in the world. You think about it, it's an amazing thing, but we're preoccupied with ourselves. But we need to get this vision out to the wider world that we stand for ourselves and that it's a great country. I firmly believe that Canada is a great country.